First one is RF safety principles, rules and guidelines, and routine station evaluation. And this refers to that additional handout on RF exposure limits, which summarizes the FCC regulations and safety principles on that. And I won't do that in any kind of detail unless you have specific questions on it, but we will go through the questions here that relate to it. What's one way that RF energy can affect the human body tissue? It heats the body tissue. Just like the RF energy in the microwave heats up whatever you put in the microwave oven. Which of the following properties is important in estimating whether an RF signal exceeds the maximum permissible exposure? Duty cycle, frequency, power density. All of these choices are correct. Duty cycle we'll see here in a bit. If you look on the exposure limits, you'll see a frequency chart there that shows you what how much power you can go at various frequencies before you need to start evaluating for RF exposure. Power density, how much power is being applied. All of these choices are important in estimating whether the maximum permissible exposure is being exceeded. How can you determine that your station complies with the FCC RF exposure regulations? You can use exposure calculations based on the FCC OET Bulletin 65, which is something that I've excerpted from in that handout. You can do calculations based on computer modeling. You can do measurements of field strength using calibrated equipment. All of those choices are correct. What does time averaging mean in reference to RF radiation exposure? It's the total RF exposure averaged over a certain time. The total exposure averaged over a certain time. If the radio frequency energy is going off and on or is varying in strength, then that can be averaged for the total exposure. What must you do if an evaluation of your station shows RF energy radiated from your station exceeds the permissible limits? You need to take action to prevent human exposure to excessive RF fields. Okay. Environmental impact statement, no, you don't do that. Get permission from your neighbors to cook them with your transmitter, no, don't do that. So all these choices are not correct. You need to take some kind of action to prevent human exposure. Now, something that's kind of ironic about this is that this principle supports having antennas way up on tall towers because that gets the RF energy field farther away from the humans on the ground. And this is an argument that has been used in defense of amateur antenna towers in neighborhoods, is to cut down the radiation exposure to people on the ground. Okay, question 6, A6 has been withdrawn from the question pool, so we don't need to worry about that. It's not missing, it's just no longer in the pool. What effect does transmitter duty cycle have when evaluating RF exposure? A lower transmitter duty cycle permits greater short-term exposure levels. And here's what we're talking about. A 10% duty cycle means your transmitter is on only 10% of the time. Okay, and that's off 90%, on for 10%, off for 90%, and so on. Okay, at 50%, it's on half the time, off half the time, on half the time, off half the time. Or at 90%, it's on 90% of the time, off 10% of the time, and so on. So that's what duty cycle means. Now, if you think about your microwave oven, if you put your microwave oven on defrost, it does this. This is how the microwave controls the power. If you do anything at 50% power level, you'll hear the RF generating parts in your microwave oven turning off and on to control the power, just like this. If you set your microwave oven to half power, you'll hear it come on for maybe 10 seconds, then it'll go off for 10 seconds, then come back on for 10 seconds, and off for 10 seconds. You have to be able to hear past the fan to hear that happening, but if you pay attention, you can hear it. Duty cycle controlling this total exposure. Which of the following steps must an amateur operator take to ensure compliance with RF safety regulations when transmitter power exceeds the level specified in Part 9713? It's to perform a routine RF exposure evaluation. And you can use the information I've given you on that handout to help you do that. Or if you're going to run high power, you'll need to get some of the other stuff to refer to. What type of instrument can be used to accurately measure an RF field? If you wanted to do an actual measurement of the field strength, you could do it with a calibrated field strength meter and a calibrated antenna to determine the actual RF field being produced by your station. What's one thing that can be done if evaluation shows that a neighbor might receive more than the allowable limit of RF exposure from the main lobe of a directional antenna? One thing you could do is just to take precautions to make sure the antenna can't be pointed that direction. Either limit your rotator in some fashion or some other way so the antenna can't be pointed that direction. What precautions should you take if you install an indoor transmitting antenna? You need to make sure that the maximum exposure limits, maximum permissible exposure limits, are not exceeded in occupied areas. So if you're going to put a magnetic mount antenna on top of a file cabinet, which is something I've done, and it'll work, you don't want to run real high power because you could be exposing yourself in your office there to greater than maximum permissible exposure. Now, the only time I've run into something like this, and let me tell you a little story here. I had a friend who bought a 2-meter radio to go into his truck. And he did the antenna on the roof, just like you do when you're doing that. But he said, I got a really good deal on this radio. I was going to buy the 55-watt radio, but the dealer gave me a 75-watt one for only $20 more, so I bought it. Sorry about that. Anyway, so we bought the 75-watt radio. We put it in the truck, put a gain antenna on the roof that gave about 3 dB of gain, which is doubling power, right? 3 dB is doubling power. So now he had an effective radiated power from his rooftop antenna of about 150 watts on 2 meters, which exceeds the maximum permissible exposure. So I told him you have to be very careful not to use high power on that, and never use high power if you're standing outside the truck. Always be sure you're sitting in it if you're using high power. Otherwise, keep your power down to the mid-level on the transceiver because at 75 watts with, and if anybody else is standing around the outside of the truck, don't use full power because you're exceeding the exposure limits. So it can be a situation as simple as that could cause you to exceed the limits. What precautions should you take whenever you make adjustments or repairs to an antenna? You want to turn off the transmitter and disconnect the feed line. Makes sense to me. What precautions should be taken when installing a ground-mounted antenna? It should be installed so that no one can be exposed to the RF radiation in excess of the maximum permissible limits. It should also be installed, this isn't part of the test, should also be installed so that no one can come in contact with any part of it that is going to be energized with radio frequency radiation because they could get an RF burn from it.